Hello, my name is Marcus Kleefman, and welcome back to your one and only favorite news crew. Today, I have a very special guest, one that has done something that many would find unfathomable. I am very honored to welcome Chris Washington. Thank you so much for having me here today. The experience that transpired changed my life forever, and I'm so grateful to be able to share this story with you today. I'm grateful to hear it. Your experience with the Armitage family opens many eyes about ideas of trauma in a modern day society. More specifically, one could say that your experience opens a window into a realm of being unable to escape one's own trauma. You're right in that, Marcus. One thing that I like to argue to people about my experience is the significance of the perception of deer during this time, which symbolizes the struggle to overcome the traumatic experience of my mother's death in my childhood. It is the symbolic interactions with deer that I had during my experience that represents the idea of being unable to escape to then overcoming my own trauma. Now, that's a very interesting observation from your experience. What part about the first incident with the deer being hit by your car has to do with trauma? And more specifically, which part of it is a reflection of your trauma? Well, you see, when I got out of the car, I was very cautious approaching the deer that had just been hit. The reason for this was because a part of me still wanted it to be alive. This came from my anxiety and guilt that I experienced when my mother died in a hit and run incident in my childhood. The reaction I had to the deer is a reflection of the same reaction I had to my mother that one fateful night. It is a symbolic representation of the lack of healing of trauma from that incident, which is shown through the denial and wary behavior I showed to the deer that had been hit. All in all, this experience shows my struggle in trying to overcome the trauma that haunts me from my childhood. I really like your analysis of that scene. The next time we see a deer is when you're trapped in the chair by the Armitage family. There's a deer above you looking down on you. How does this scene relate to the traumatic events in your childhood? Well, you see, in this scene, the deer is still a visual representation of my mother's death. When I sat there strapped down to the chair, there were lots of similarities in my actions to that fateful night that my mother died. These similarities include the comparison between the scratching of the bedpost and the ripping of the sofa chair. In both scenes, I was trapped and unable to move due to my want to not accept the reality of my situation. While strapped to that chair, I showed emotions of fear and denial, the same ones I showed when I found out my mother had passed. In both scenes, I did not want to accept the situation that I was in. The visual of you being trapped in the chair and forced to look at the deer above you, do you feel that imagery has any importance in the theme of trauma during this experience? I do feel it does. The detail of me being trapped in the chair is one that represents my inability to escape from my own trauma. This idea comes from my denial to accept the reality of what is happening around me, as well as the great deal of anxiety that constantly overcomes me. Evidence for this anxiety comes from the constant knocking of my hands on chair and tables, as well as my addiction to smoking. Now, interestingly, the one thing that was holding you down is what inevitably helped you overcome the situation. Do you feel that this is symbolic in you accepting what happened to you in your childhood? I personally do believe it is. I used the head of the deer to kill Dean Armitage, as well as the cotton from the chair to block me from hearing the noise from the tea. What this image represents is that one can only overcome the trauma through facing it head on. In this case, this comes from me using the head of the deer and the chair to escape from the Armitage family. On a deeper level, it shows my growth as a character, being able to overcome the denial from what happened to my mother that day by facing it head on and using those emotions to give me power. It was only then that I was able to start overcoming my own trauma. Now, that is truly an incredible story. I'd like to thank you for coming on the show with me here today. Before we sign out, what is one thing that you could tell the audience watching at home right now? From my own experience, I always tried to run away from my trauma. I was fearful of it, but the one way I was able to overcome this was through facing it head on. When I was able to do that, it gave me the power over my life and allowed me to escape from a very dangerous situation. Thanks so much for being here with me today, Chris, and thank you all for tuning in at home.